So, think about this. What happens when a whole continent story, for centuries, isn't told by its own people? When it's told by outsiders, and maybe they don't see the real picture, maybe they just see, I don't know, a shadow, or even a caricature.
Yeah, or worse, when your history is actively twisted, to make the conqueror look good.
Exactly. It creates this gap, doesn't it? A kind of historical amnesia.
It really does. And the big challenge then becomes, okay, you have this incredibly powerful ancient tradition, the spoken word, the voice that held everything together. How do you take that immense cultural weight and somehow translate it into writing? Which is revolutionary, sure, but often it's been co-opted, hasn't it?
Right. And here's maybe the thorniest question.
Yeah.
If the language you kind of have to use maybe to reach a global audience, or even just people in your own diverse nation, if that language is the colonizer's language, can you ever truly reclaim your story using that tool? Can the very thing used to dismantle your culture somehow become the tool to rebuild it?
That's the core struggle, isn't it?
Wow, it is. And that's what we're diving into today, this foundational project, really, of modern Africa, the struggle in literature to reclaim and redefine the narrative. Welcome to a new episode from our series, The Story of Literature, from English Plus Podcast.
So our mission today, it's really about moving past just the sheer size of African literature. I mean, you've got 54 nations, over 2,000 languages, countless cultures. It's vast.
It's immense.
Absolutely. But we want to track a specific thread, a historical and frankly political one that connects so many great writers over the last, say, 70 years. And that's the fight for narrative control, autonomy.
Yeah, it's less about mapping the continent and more about understanding a power struggle, right? For centuries, the story was basically told by those in power.
The hunters, as the saying goes.
Exactly. So we're looking at that shift, the moment when, well, you get that famous question, probably the most quoted idea in all post-colonial literature. What happens when the lion finally learns how to write?
That's the turning point.
Okay, so to really grasp how radical modern African writing is, we can't start with books. We have to start where literature itself started for most of the continent.
With the voice.
With the human voice. For thousands of years, Africa's greatest literature, its epics, its histories, they weren't written down. They were performed. They were sung. They were lived.
And that's such a critical point. We need to really stress this. Oral tradition wasn't some primitive stage just waiting for writing to come along and make it better.
Right. It wasn't incomplete.
Not at all. It was, and in many places, it still is, a completely dynamic, sophisticated art form in its own right. The complexity was in its delivery system. You had these incredibly trained individuals whose memory was the archive, the living, breathing archive for the whole community.
And the prime example of this, especially when you look at West Africa, is the Griot, or the Jali in Mandinka.
That's right, Jali. And when we use that term, Griot or Jali, we need to understand we're not just talking about some guy telling folktales around a fire.
No, it's much bigger.
It's an institution, a profession. The Griot is, or was, absolutely central to the society's history and structure. They are the professional keepers of memory. Think about all the hats they wore.
Yeah.
They're the historians, reciting these incredibly detailed genealogies, sometimes going back, dozens of generations. They're advisors to kings and leaders, using ancient stories and proverbs to shed light on current problems. They're social commentators, weaving sharp critiques into songs.
Wow. So historian, advisor, commentator.
And musician. The performance aspect is key. It's inherently multimodal. There's music, often involving instruments like the kora.
Ah, the kora, that beautiful 21-string harp lute thing.
Exactly. Such an iconic instrument. And for anyone who hasn't heard it, people often describe the sound as almost celestial, like a harp maybe. No. But it carries this incredible weight of history with it. It's not just pretty music.
So music is part of it? What else?
Well, the performance is also a conversation. It often uses call and response. The griot says something, the audience responds.
Ah, so the audience isn't passive.
Not at all. They're active participants. They're helping to reaffirm their own history, their own identity, every single time. History isn't something you just consume. It's something the community actively rebuilds and maintains together through these performances.
Okay, can we have a concrete example? Like, what kind of story would a griot tell?
Absolutely. A classic example is the Epic of Sundiata. This tells the story of Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Great Mali Empire, back in the 13th century.
Right, a foundational story for a huge part of West Africa.
Exactly. And for Over 800 years, this epic, this foundational text existed almost entirely through the voices and the memories of Griot families passing it down.
That's incredible. 8 centuries.
And that really shows you the power of the living text. Because while the core story, the key events, the names, the lineage is preserved with amazing accuracy, each griot isn't just reciting, they're recreating it. They subtly reinterpret, shift the emphasis maybe to speak to this specific audience, this particular moment. So it's always relevant. It's a living event, not some dusty old manuscript.
So you start to realize for these empires, the griots' memory literally was the national archive.
Yes.
And their performance, their voice was like the Constitution. It wasn't just entertainment on the side.
Absolutely not. It was fundamental. Literature, in this context, was a core social and political force. It was essential for keeping the state running, for maintaining identity.
So when you grasp that the griot controlled the voice of history itself, you understand just how massive the disruption was when colonial powers came in.
Oh, completely. Because they didn't just bring guns and flags, they systematically tried to replace that incredibly complex, nuanced internal history with their own external, simplified, and often, let's face it, self-serving story.
They were trying to silence the archive?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Mute the nation's memory.
Okay, so this world, the self-sustaining world of oral history, it basically slams into the industrial age, right? Late 19th century, you get the scramble for Africa.
Yeah, that infamous period where European powers just carved up the continent with rulers on a map.
And they impose new governments, new languages, and critically for our story, a new kind of education.
Right, colonial education.
Yeah.
And the generation that would produce these giants of African literature, Achebe, Soyinka, and Thiong'o, they were products of these schools.
So they're reading Shakespeare, Dickens, Jane Austen, the English classic.
Exactly. They're absorbing the European literary canon, often taught as the standard, the model they were expected to imitate.
But then, what happens when these very smart, educated students look into that literature for reflections of themselves, of their own home?
Well, they find one of two things, generally. Either nothing, a complete void, like Africa doesn't exist or isn't worth writing about.
And the emptiness.
An assumed emptiness. Or, maybe worse, they find these grotesque caricatures, distortions.
And the classic example here has to be Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
Oh, right, absolutely. Published in 1899, it became the defining book about Africa for so many in the West for decades. But if you read it from the perspective of someone actually from the place Conrad is describing, the omission, the distortion, it's profound, almost criminal, you could say.
Because Africa in that book, it's not really a place with real people, complex societies.
Not at all. It's explicitly used as a symbol. It's the dark, primitive backdrop for a European character's psychological collapse. The African characters in the book, they're barely characters. They're like props.
Shadowy figures.
Grunting, shadowy figures, part of the threatening landscape. They have no agency, no culture of their own presented. They're completely dehumanized.
And Chinua Achebe, later on, he directly called Conrad out on this, didn't he? Famously.
He did. He gave a very controversial lecture arguing that Heart of Darkness, despite its literary merits, was fundamentally racist and dehumanizing. And it was that experience, seeing his own people, the Igbo people, reduced to these savage footnotes in someone else's story, that really lit the fire, that triggered the revolution in writing.
Which brings us back to that proverb you mentioned.
Until the lion has his own historian, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Achebe got it. The hunter's story was the only one being told because the hunter controlled the narrative, controlled the writing.
Exactly. So Achebe's mission, starting with his masterpiece, Things Fall Apart, in 1958, it was a conscious act. He set out to grab that pen and start writing the lion's story.
He wrote it specifically then to push back.
Absolutely. He said so himself. He wanted to show the West, but maybe even more importantly, show his own people, who'd been through colonial education, that the Igbo had a complex, sophisticated, functioning society before the white man ever arrived.
And the way he does that in the first half of the novel, it's incredible. It's pure immersion.
It really is. You're just dropped into this village, Umolfia. You follow the main character, Okonkwo. And crucially, Achebe doesn't hold your hand. There are no footnotes explaining Igbo terms, no glossary at the back.
He makes you work for it.
He forces you, the reader, to slow down, to figure things out from the context, just like you would if you actually entered that world.
And through that, you learn about their society. You mentioned the Igbo were democratic.
Yes, highly value achievement over birthright. You learn about Their justice system, these masked figures, the Ngũgĩ, who represent the ancestral spirits and function like judges. It all works. But maybe the most important thing we learn connects back to the Griots.
Which is?
Their deep respect for language itself. How conversation is seen as an art.
Ah, that famous line. Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten.
Exactly. Palm oil makes food richer, more digestible, more flavorful. Proverbs do the same for conversation. They're not just catchy phrases. They're how you communicate complex ideas, history, moral judgments, subtly, respectfully, drawing on collective wisdom.
So by showing that level of linguistic sophistication,
he instantly shatters that colonial stereotype of the primitive, inarticulate African, doesn't he?
Completely. And it's only after he's so carefully built up this rich world that, well, the second half of the book happens, the falling apart.
Yes. And Achebe is brilliant here, too, showing how it wasn't just brute force that destroyed the culture. It was more insidious. It was strategic. It was intellectual conquest as much as physical. Well, the culture cracks along its own existing fault lines, you see. The Christian missionaries, when they first arrive, they don't initially convert the powerful figures like Okonkwo.
No. Who do they go for?
They go for the marginalized, the outcasts, people like the mothers of twins. Twins were considered an offense against the earth and left to die in the evil forest. They go for the Osu, the lowest caste, people who felt excluded by the traditional system. The church offered them acceptance, a community, status they didn't have before.
Ah, clever. Undermining from the edges.
Precisely. And while the missionaries are chipping away at the spiritual foundations, the colonial administrators, personified by the district commissioner, are setting up their own courts, their own laws.
Right. Replacing the traditional justice system.
Not just replacing, but actively delegitimizing it. Suddenly, the rulings of the Ngũgĩ don't matter anymore compared to the British court. This new system, with its rigid foreign rules, slowly erodes the entire moral and social fabric of the community.
And that's what leads to Okonkwo's downfall. He can't accept these changes.
He can't adapt. His whole identity is tied to the old ways, to strength, to tradition. And when he finally tries to rally resistance, it's too late. The community is too divided, too weakened internally. His act of defiance becomes futile, tragic.
And then there's that ending, that final paragraph. It's just devastating.
Utterly chilling, isn't it? After Okonkwo's suicide itself a terrible offense in Igbo culture, the district commissioner looks at the scene, thinking about the book he plans to write.
The pacification of the primitive tribes of the Lower Niger, ugh.
Right. And he thinks Okonkwo's story, this epic tragedy we've just lived through, might merit a reasonable paragraph.
Paragraph?
That single line is Achebe's ultimate act of literary revenge, you could say. It perfectly encapsulates the entire colonial project, reducing a complex human tragedy, the collapse of a world, into a self-congratulatory footnote in the conqueror's narrative of pacification.
Achebe basically reclaims the entire novel from that one dismissive paragraph.
He does. And this brings us to maybe his most radical decision of all.
Which was?
Writing this whole revolutionary novel in English.
Right, the language of the colonizer. Why?
Well, he didn't just use English, he did something new with it. He bent it, reshaped it. He famously said he wanted to create a new English, one that was able to carry the weight of my African experience.
How did he do that? What does that mean in practice?
It means he wasn't just translating Igbo ideas into standard English. He was forcing English itself to adopt Igbo rhythms, Igbo sentence structures, Igbo ways of thinking. He weaves in Igbo words and proverbs without translation.
Like we saw with the palm oil proverb.
Exactly. He makes the English reader slow down, infer meaning, almost learn to think differently just to follow the story. He's making the colonial language carry an African weight, adopt an African cadence. He's decolonizing the language from within.
And that act, it must have been hugely significant for other African writers.
Oh, immense. It gave them permission. It showed it as possible. It opened the floodgates for a whole generation.
Okay, so Things Fall Apart is a huge success. Achebe becomes a global figure. But that success, using English, it immediately sparks this massive debate, doesn't it? Probably the central debate in post-colonial literature.
Absolutely. The language question.
Yeah.
What is the right language for the African writer? Is using English or French or Portuguese, the colonial languages, is it a practical necessity? Or is it somehow a continuation of that same colonization, just mentally?
It's a real dilemma. On one side, you have the pragmatists, like Achebe himself.
Right, and their argument makes sense, especially then. English offered really two crucial things. First, in a country like Nigeria, which is incredibly diverse linguistically.
Hundreds of languages.
Exactly. English could act as a common ground, a unifying force, maybe the only one available. And second, it allowed African writers to speak directly to a global audience to finally tell the lion story on the world stage.
Makes sense. But then you have the other side, represented most powerfully by the great Kenyan writer Ngũgĩ Thiong'o.
Ngũgĩ. He started out writing acclaimed novels in English too, like Weep Not Child. But his perspective shifted radically.
Was it just a literary thing? Or was politics involved? Because he got into serious trouble with the Kenyan government, didn't he? He was detained without trial in the late 70s.
Oh, absolutely. The political context is crucial. His writing, especially his theater work in the Gikuyu language, was seen as highly critical, highly dangerous by the regime. So for Ngũgĩ, the stakes were incredibly high. Political, personal, existential.
What was his argument about language?
He laid it out incredibly powerfully in his book, Decolonizing the Mind. He argued that the most dangerous weapon colonialism used wasn't the gun, wasn't the military. It was what he called the cultural bomb.
The cultural bomb? Okay, what does that mean? What does it destroy?
According to Ngũgĩ, the cultural bomb works by systematically destroying a people's belief in their own culture, and their names, their history, their environment, their languages, ultimately their belief in themselves. And he stressed that language isn't just a neutral tool for communication, it's the carrier of culture. It holds collective memory, identity, ways of seeing the world. So if you force Africans to write their most important works, their literature, in a European language, you're continuing the work of that bomb. That's exactly his point. Even if you do it brilliantly, like Achebe, you are still structurally elevating the colonizer's language and culture above the mother tongues, above the languages of the people themselves. You're perpetuating a kind of mental colonization.
So that deep conviction led him to make a really drastic choice.
Astonishingly radical, yes. Ngũgĩ completely renounced English for his creative writing. He declared he would write novels and plays only in his mother tongue, Gikuyu.
Wow, that's a huge decision. I mean, didn't that cut him off from his international audience, from the big publishers, the prizes?
It absolutely did. It was a massive sacrifice in terms of global reach and recognition. And that's the painful center of the debate, isn't it? Did he risk isolating himself from the very conversation that Achebe fought to join?
So why do it? What was his goal?
For Ngũgĩ, it was about principle, but also about connection. His stated goal was explicit. He wanted to reconnect with the majority of his people in Kenya, the peasants, the workers who couldn't read the English novels written by the educated elite. He wanted his literature to belong to them, to speak directly to their reality in their own language.
And the story of him writing his first Gikuyu novel, Devil on the Cross, while imprisoned, that just underlines the commitment, doesn't it?
It's incredible. Apparently, he wrote it on scraps of toilet paper.
No way.
Yes. Think about that. Writing in secret, under constant threat, using the most basic, debased material imaginable in a language the government was actively trying to suppress. It's more than just writing a book. It's this profound act of defiance, of cultural recommitment, proving the language in the story could survive anything.
Still, Achebe's point about practicality, especially for nation building, it still holds weight, doesn't it? Why was English so important for Nigeria, for example?
Well, think about the situation right after independence. Nigeria, as we said, is huge and diverse. Over 250 distinct languages. 3 major regional language groups: Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, often in competition. In that volatile post-colonial moment, if you tried to make Igbo the national language, or Yoruba or Hausa, how would the other groups react?
They'd see it as one group dominating again, like internal colonialism.
Exactly. So, ironically, English, the language imposed by the external colonizer, became this kind of neutral, maybe necessary common ground.
A necessary evil, perhaps.
Perhaps. Achebe argued that through the shared experience of colonialism and education, English had, in a sense, become an African language too. It belonged to Nigerians now. It was the only practical way maybe for an Igbo writer to communicate easily with a Yoruba reader, or for the government to function without sparking ethnic conflict over language.
So you have these two towering figures, Achebe and Ngũgĩ, with deeply held opposing views.
Yes, and the debate between them, the sheer intellectual energy and passion they brought to it, was incredibly important. That very debate helped forge the identity of modern African literature itself.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about choosing a language, it was about defining what it meant to be an African writer after colonialism.
Okay, so if Achebe and Ngũgĩ kind of set the terms of that initial post-colonial debate, unity versus purity, pragmatism versus linguistic decolonization. What happens next? Let's fast forward a bit into the 21st century.
Right. We get a new generation of writers. You call them the literary children or grandchildren of Achebe and Ngũgĩ. And they're dealing with a different world, aren't they? Yeah. Globalization, mass migration, these huge, vibrant, complex African cities like Lagos or Nairobi, the diaspora experience.
The landscape has changed.
It has. And these writers, they're beneficiaries of that earlier struggle. They're navigating a world where maybe the power dynamics have shifted a bit, but those old stereotypes, they definitely still linger.
And maybe the most globally recognized voice from this generation, representing that confidence and complexity, is Nigeria's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
Absolutely. Adichie is phenomenal. And she's known not just for her incredible novels, but for articulating something really crucial, a kind of guiding principle for so much modern writing.
You mean her idea of the danger of a single story?
Exactly that. Her TED Talk on it went viral for a reason. It's such a sharp insight. What she points out is that the real problem with stereotypes, whether it's the old dark continent myths, or maybe more modern media images that only show poverty or war, the problem isn't necessarily that they're completely false. Often, there might be a grain of truth somewhere in there. The danger is that they are radically incomplete.
Right. It takes one story, one aspect, often negative, and makes it the only story.
Precisely. That single story gets repeated until it defines the entire reality for the outside world, and sometimes dangerously, even for the people being described. It flattens complexity, limits potential, dictates who you're allowed to be. So Adichie's work, in many ways, is about actively dismantling those single stories.
Okay, so how do we see that in her novels? Let's take Half of a Yellow Sun. That deals with the Biafran War, right?
Yes, published in 2006. It's an epic historical novel about the Nigerian Civil War in the late 1960s. A hugely traumatic event, rooted in those arbitrary colonial borders and the ethnic tensions that flared up after independence. Millions died, mostly Igbo civilians in Biafra, often through starvation. But it was conflict often misunderstood, simplified, or just ignored in the West.
So the novel is kind of reclaiming that history.
It's absolutely an act of reclaiming memory, yes. But she does it by focusing intensely on the human cost. The scope feels epic, but the viewpoint is always intimate. She avoids just giving us facts and figures about the war. Instead, she weaves the story around the lives of 5 unforgettable, deeply flawed, very human characters. You have Odenigbo, the passionate, radical university professor; Olana, his beautiful, educated partner from a wealthy Lagos family; Kane, Olana's pragmatic, sharp-tongued twin sister; Richard, Kane's white British lover, a writer trying to find his place; and Ugu, the young village boy who comes to work as Odenigbo's houseboy and whose perspective anchors much of the story.
So you see the war through all these different eyes.
Exactly. Through the intellectual debates in Odenigbo's living room, through the struggles of privileged women forced into refugee life, through the naive observations of Ugu as he's drawn into the conflict. You see how huge historical forces play out in the most personal spaces: the kitchen, the bedroom, relationships fracturing under pressure. It refuses to let the war be just an abstraction. It gives it human faces, human complexity.
Okay. And then she shifts gears quite dramatically with her next big novel, Americana, in 2013.
Totally different focus, yes. Americana is very much about the here and now, the 21st century globalized experience. It follows Ifemelu, a young Nigerian woman who leaves Lagos to go to university in the United States.
And it becomes this brilliant exploration of race, identity, migration.
And often very funny, too. She uses Ifemelu's blog, which is embedded in the novel, as this sharp, satirical tool to dissect American culture, particularly its racial dynamics, from an outsider's perspective.
What kind of things does she explore?
Well, really important nuances that often get lost, like the difference between being African-American with that specific history of slavery and struggle in the U.S., and being what Ifemelu calls a non-American black. Someone whose primary identity wasn't forged in America, who comes from a place where blackness wasn't the defining minority characteristic.
That's a fascinating distinction.
It really is.
Yeah.
And she gets into things that might seem small, but are actually huge identity markers, like the politics of black hair.
Right. There's a lot about hair in the book.
There is. Ifemelu's struggles with relaxing her hair, learning about natural hair, the social pressures, the expense, the time. It becomes this powerful metaphor for navigating assimilation, authenticity, and racial expectations in America. How something so personal becomes so political.
And then Ifemelu eventually goes back to Nigeria, doesn't she?
Yes. And that's maybe the most compelling part. She returns to this booming, modern, complicated Lagos full of energy and problems and finds she doesn't quite fit anymore.
She's changed too much.
She's changed. America has shaped her. But she's not really American either. She exists in this in-between space, this transnational identity that's so characteristic of our time. She can't just slot back neatly into the old box. Lagos has changed too.
So Adichie, in a way, she represents the outcome of that whole literary journey we've been tracing.
I think so. She embodies this refusal to be boxed in. Refusing the old colonial stereotypes, refusing the single story of Africa as only crisis or poverty, but also moving beyond narratives defined solely by the struggle against colonialism. Her characters are just people, complex, modern, dealing with love, work, identity, hair, living full lives on a global stage.
The Lion isn't just writing history anymore.
The Lion is writing novels, blogs, love stories, critiques, confidently shaping the terms of their own present and future. They've learned to use both the power of the voice, that ancient wisdom, and the power of the page.
What an incredible arc we've covered. From the Griot, the living archive holding centuries of history and memory and performance.
Yeah, that indispensable singing library of a whole civilization.
To Chinua Achebe's deliberate revolutionary act, using the master's language and Things Fall Apart to write back, to prove the richness of the world the colonizer tried to erase.
And then that fierce intellectual battle over language itself. Achebe's pragmatism versus Ngũgĩ's radical commitment to Gikuyu, that defiant decolonization of the mind, even writing on toilet paper in prison.
Such powerful opposing stances.
Absolutely. And finally, seeing how a writer like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie inherits all of that, stands confidently on the world stage, explores these complex, multiple modern identities, and actively works to dismantle that damaging idea of the single story.
It really shows, doesn't it, how this literature is about so much more than just telling stories.
It's about power. It's about survival. It's about that fundamental human right to name your own world, define your own reality.
So we focus today on this literary struggle for narrative control, the hunter, the lion, the historian. It makes you think, though. How many stories that you encounter every day, maybe in the news you read, the films you watch, the social media you scroll through, how many might still be filtered through a kind of single story, maybe imposed by a powerful external perspective, a modern-day historian?
What story, maybe of your own culture, your own community, or even yourself, needs reclaiming? Needs a closer look, needs diversifying beyond the single narrative you might have been given. Something to think about. And this was another episode from our series, The Story of Literature, from English Plus Podcast. Remember that what we mentioned is just an introduction for you to step into the huge and beautiful world of world literature. So don't settle for what you have learned in this series. Start hunting for the hidden gems you can find in literatures all around the world. And don't stray far at the beginning. Start from your own culture and literature. I bet there's a lot of magnificent works of literature to be found right in your own backyard. Thanks for listening. Stay curious and never stop learning with English Plus Podcast.